Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about Clive Barker's Hellraiser, based on his book, The Hellbound Heart. I have my Lament configuration fluffy dice beside me in preparation. There is a lot to appreciate about this movie, so I'm excited to talk about it. The movie opens with Frank Cotton purchasing the puzzle box, the Lament configuration. Frank is a man who is desperate for an experience beyond anything he's ever had before, so he seeks out the box, believing that it will open a doorway to the pleasures of heaven or hell, and he does not care which. Later, when Frank solves the box, the Cenobites come for him, and Frank is torn apart by hooked chains. Frank wanted an experience, and he got a lot more than he had bargained for. Frank Cotton is now trapped in hell because he's a silly goose. Frank's desperation led him to interact with forces beyond his comprehension, and he paid a heavy price. And I like this opening quite a bit. We then jump to Larry and Julia moving into their new home. Larry is Frank's brother. Julia is Larry's wife. We meet Kirsty, Larry's daughter. We learn that Kirsty and Julia don't have a good relationship. We learn that Julia is not Kirsty's biological mother, and that Kirsty's biological mother is dead. Upstairs, in one of the rooms, Julia finds a photograph of Frank. And we get a flashback of when Julia had an affair with Frank. Julia was drawn to Frank's dark side, and she soon became obsessed with him. In the flashback, when Frank goes to leave, Julia begs him to stay, saying she'll do anything. But Frank leaves, simply stating, "It's never enough." And then the flashback ends, and downstairs we see Larry is helping move a bed, and he cuts his hand off a nail. He goes upstairs to show Julia the wound, and he bleeds on the floor in the room where Frank was taken by the Cenobites. It's Larry's blood that will bring Frank back from hell. Larry bleeds so that Frank may rise again. By the end of the movie, Frank will have taken everything from Larry, and it begins with a few drops of blood. It's good stuff. Later, when the room is empty, Frank Cotton begins to regenerate using Larry's blood. And Frank's regeneration process is a good example of practical special effects. Also, the score for this scene is not what you would typically expect from a horror movie. It's the kind of music you would use for a scene where something amazing is happening, not horrific. It's an interesting choice, and I like it quite a bit. Frank is restored, but only partially. Later, when Julia discovers Frank, he tries to convince her to help him. He explains that he will need more blood, more sacrifices in order to be whole again. And Julia agrees because Julia is obsessed with the idea of being with Frank. Frank and Larry are two men on opposite ends of a spectrum. Larry is safe but dull. Frank is dangerous but exciting. And Julia chooses Frank. Julia seduces a man, and she brings him back to the house. She then kills him with a hammer, and we see that Frank feeds off the body. There's this disgusting slurp noise when Frank feeds, like he's sucking their blood out through a straw. It's gross. I love it. Julia is willing to sacrifice human lives in order to be with Frank. And it seems to not just be blood, but human life force that Frank feeds off. I don't think that animal blood would do the job. It seems to be specifically humans. More of Frank has been restored, but he is still not completely whole. He gestures to Julia to come closer, and we get that creepy line that, that Frank seems to be famous for. Come to daddy. It's a line that will be important later. Frank finally shows Julia the box, and he explains that the Cenobites will come after him. The Cenobites will come after Frank once they realize that he has escaped them. Frank and Julia need to hurry and restore Frank completely. More sacrifices are necessary, and Julia is more than willing. Later, we see Larry and Julia watching boxing on TV, and Larry notes that the boxing doesn't bother Julia as much as it used to. This scene shows us that Julia is becoming desensitized to violence. We also get a sequence where Julia tries to keep Larry from discovering Frank, and we see that Julia does actually care for Larry. She doesn't want Frank to hurt him, although that goes out the window pretty soon. While having dinner with Kirsty, Larry wants her to go check on Julia and figure out what's up with her, as Julia has been acting a little weird. When Kirsty goes to the house, she sees Julia bringing another man inside. And when Kirsty goes in to investigate, she discovers a dead body and a skinless man who reveals himself to be Frank. Good old Uncle Frank. And we get that come to daddy line again, because Frank is a weirdo. Frank tries to subdue Kirsty, but she fights back. Kirsty grabs the puzzle box to use as a weapon, and she discovers that it is important to Frank. She throws the box out the window to distract Frank, and then Kirsty makes her escape. Kirsty walks the streets, puzzle box in hand, and she's mentally and physically exhausted, and she ends up passing out on the street. She wakes up in a hospital claiming that she can't fully recall what had happened to her. They decide to leave Kirsty alone with the box, thinking that it might jog her memory. Kirsty is curious about this mysterious puzzle box, so she decides to solve it. Luckily, Kirsty is not immediately torn apart by hooked chains like Frank was. Instead, Kirsty gets a chance to talk herself out of this horrific situation. Then we get our first proper easy for you to say, proper introduction to the Cenobites. And this is probably my favorite scene of the movie. It's certainly one of the best. I love that ominous bell sound we hear before the Cenobites arrive. It's great. When the Cenobites appear, they explain to Kirsty who they are. Demons to some, angels to others. The Cenobites offer an experience of extreme sensation, and they take whoever solves the box. Kirsty is not so keen on this idea, so she attempts to make a deal. She informs the Cenobites that Frank Cotton has escaped them. Kirsty offers Frank in place of her, and the lead Cenobite, the iconic Pinhead, says that he wants to hear Frank confess himself. Then, maybe, they will leave her be, and that maybe is quite important. The Cenobites then warn Kirsty that if she tries to cheat them, they will tear her soul apart. A great line to end a great scene. A line delivered perfectly by the amazing Doug Bradley. We jump back to Frank and Julia. Time is ticking. They must get Frank a new skin before the Cenobites come for him. Because time is short, they decide to kill Larry and take his skin. We have seen earlier that Julia does actually care about Larry, but her desire for Frank overrules all else. She agrees to sacrifice Larry for Frank. Julia and Frank are two irredeemable monsters who will destroy anyone in order to get what they want. But their dark nature will ultimately be their downfall. When Larry arrives home, Julia brings him upstairs to Frank. We cut to Kirsty arriving at the house to warn Larry about Frank. And when she does tell Larry about Frank, Larry says that he knows all about it. He tells Kirsty that he has killed Frank. This is good and bad news. On one hand, her father is safe. On the other hand, Kirsty now has nothing to offer the Cenobites. Kirsty goes upstairs to see Frank's dead body, but as we will soon discover, it is in fact Larry's body she's looking at. Frank Cotton has taken everything from his brother. It began with a few drops of blood, then he took Julia, then his life, and even his skin. Frank now wears his brother's face. Frank Cotton is the kind of man who will take everything from you without giving it a second thought. Kirsty is alone with the body, the dead body, when the Cenobites appear. Pinhead says they want the man who did this, gesturing to the dead body. But Kirsty does not want to give up who she thinks is her father. Kirsty heads downstairs and tries to leave with Larry. And then it is revealed that Larry is Frank. He says that come to daddy line again, and this gives him away. Kirsty tries to escape, but Julia subdues her. Frank goes to stab Kirsty, but she moves out of the way, and Frank stabs Julia by mistake. And Frank doesn't feel bad about this whatsoever. He begins to absorb Julia's life force and says, "Nothing personal, babe," a line that will come back at him in the sequel in a very satisfying scene. We see that Frank never really cared about Julia and he was just using her. Frank is not capable of genuinely caring about anyone but himself. The very thing Julia was drawn to ends up destroying her, just like Frank. Frank traps Kirsty in the room with the dead body. And when Frank refers to himself as dear old Uncle Frank, that gives him away to the Cenobites. And then the Cenobites come to take him back. The female Cenobite says, "We had to hear it from your own lips." And I always thought it was funny that they're not technically his lips, they're technically his brother's lips, but however. Then come the hooked chains, and just before Frank is torn apart, he says, "Jesus wept." And I believe this line was improvised by the actor, which is pretty cool. Frank then gives one last defiant laugh before being torn apart once again. Frank's dark nature led him right back to hell. Kirsty tries to leave, but the Cenobites decide that they want to take her also. After all, they did say maybe. In one of the rooms, Kirsty finds Julia's dead body on a bed, and we see that Julia has opened the box, probably out of desperation. Kirsty takes the box and uses it to send the Cenobites back to where they came from. Kirsty escapes as the house begins to fall apart around her. When Kirsty is out of harm's way, she throws the box in a fire in an attempt to destroy it. And throughout the movie, there has been a homeless man following Kirsty, and this homeless man rescues the box from the fire before he transforms into some kind of winged creature and flies off with the box. And that ends Hellraiser, a movie about a man who just can't stay out of hell. And I like this movie quite a bit. It's not a perfect movie. Some of the acting isn't great. Some character decisions and reactions are a bit wonky. Some of the special effects are poor, as to be expected from a low budget movie. There are some parts here and there where I feel like there's some things put in there that don't really have a purpose behind them beyond just maybe vibes, that kind of thing. Kirsty's boyfriend adds nothing to the movie. I would just remove him altogether. But overall, there's a lot to appreciate about this movie. And the characters are not terribly complex, but they all function well within the story. It's a good movie that I would recommend. If you like this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Maybe share the video if you know a Hellraiser fan. You can follow me on Instagram at Stephen Carey Stories. There will be a link in the description if you want to go check that out. Let me know in the comments which Hellraiser movies you think are good, which you think are not so good. My favorites would be 1, 2, and 3 in that order. I think that 1 is the best written. 2 has a lot in it that I like. 3 is the most flawed in terms of writing, but I always enjoy giving it a watch. I wouldn't really recommend a lot of the sequels. It's been a while since I've seen some of them, so maybe they're better than I remember. If you would recommend any of these movies beyond 3, let me know. I must give them a rewatch. I haven't seen that found footage one because it just did not look very good at all. If you've seen it and you like it, let me know. I might watch it. I might stick it on the next Halloween list. Thanks for listening, everybody. I should be back next week with another video. I'm considering doing something on The Fly. I really like The Fly. Possibly Friday the 13th. Let me know what you would like to see next. Okay, everyone. Thanks for listening and see you next week. Bye bye.